Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating legal case where the fight wasn't just about what someone did, but about what the words themselves actually mean.
So that right there, that was the official reasoning from the court for convicting Dr. Chen Jingyuan, a physicist with a PhD in complex systems theory. You see, the verdict itself really hinges on this one idea, that his education somehow made him more guilty, not less.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right? This case forces us to ask a huge question. When the state and a scholar have completely different definitions for the same words, who gets to be right? Okay, let's break this down.
First up, let's meet our central figure, Dr. Chen Jingyuan. Now, his background as a physicist is absolutely key to understanding why this whole legal battle basically turned into a war over logic itself. So after a career in science and tech, Dr. Chen becomes this independent scholar. He spends his time sharing all sorts of content online, art, political commentary, history. But then, in 2022, he's arrested. And the charge? It's this very vague but serious crime that's often translated as picking quarrels and provoking trouble. And he got this all for just forwarding some posts.
All right, now let's get into the official case against him. The court's entire argument was built on this simple-looking, three-step chain of logic.
Okay, so the prosecution argued that 1, he spread false information. 2, because of his fancy education, he did it knowingly. And 3, this caused some kind of severe chaos. Seems pretty straightforward on the surface, doesn't it? Well, this is exactly where the story gets wild, because every single step of this argument was challenged, not based on facts, but based on the very meaning of the words.
So when philosophers started looking at this case, they basically said, hold on a second. The real fight here isn't about what Dr. Chen did. It's about a fundamental disagreement over what the court's own words even mean. It was literally a war over language.
So let's start with false information. The court basically took everything Dr. Chen shared, art, academic articles, even political cartoons, and just dumped it all into one big box labeled false. But philosophers have a name for this. They call it a category error. You just can't call an opinion or a piece of art false in the same way you can call a scientific claim false. They're totally different things, and the court was judging them all by one single inappropriate rule.
Okay, next up, this idea that he acted knowingly. The court basically saw his PhD as an obligation. He should have known to accept their version of the truth. But from a philosophical point of view, his scientific training taught him to do the exact opposite, to question, to analyze, and to stay skeptical. You see the conflict. The court saw education as a tool for compliance. Dr. Chen saw it as a tool for inquiry.
And finally, this is the big one. What about the severe public disorder? The prosecution never actually showed any evidence of real chaos. There were no protests, no incidents, nothing. Philosophers argue that the court just created this perfectly circular argument. The act of sharing the posts was the disorder. The crime became its own consequence, with zero proof of any real-world harm.
So, how on earth can we make sense of these two completely different ways of interpreting the exact same words? Well, the philosophers who examined this case used a framework called analytic philosophy. And it's less of a theory and more like a toolkit for thinking clearly.
I love these analogies. This framework gives them a bunch of tools to work with. They used logical analysis, kind of like an engineer, to check if the court's argument was structurally sound. They used conceptual analysis, like a chemist, to break down the real meaning of a word like disorder. And, most importantly, they used language analysis, kind of like a carpenter, making sure their tools are sharp to examine the words themselves.
And the key tool here really is language analysis. It teaches us that words get their meaning from the context they're used in, the language game, so to speak. Think about it. The rules for proving something false in a science lab are totally different from the rules in a courtroom, which are again different from the rules when you're critiquing a piece of art. The court's big mistake was judging all of these different language games by its own legal rules, and only its rules.
So, you see, at the end of the day, this case wasn't just about a man forwarding some posts online. It was about something much bigger. Who has the authority to set the rules of the language game itself?
And in the end, what we're left with are two conflicting realities. Both are constructed from the exact same set of events, but they're using entirely different dictionaries.
In the court's reality, language is a tool to maintain social order. The words mean whatever the state needs them to mean to get that job done. But in the philosopher's reality, language is a tool for seeking logical truth. Words have to be tied to evidence, and they have to make sense. Dr. Chen was living in one of these realities, and being judged by the rules of the other.
And this quote just brilliantly sums up the whole issue. One analysis concluded that the court's main claim that sharing the posts was the disorder was logically meaningless. They called it a pseudo-proposition. It's like saying, this rock is a dream. It doesn't actually make logical sense, but it was enforced as if it were real through the absolute power of the legal system.
Which leaves us with a final, really powerful question. This whole case highlights that true power isn't just held by the people who write the laws, but by the people who get to define the words inside those laws. It really makes you stop and ask, how does the language that we're all forced to use shape our freedom, and maybe even our reality itself?